The Starwing Drift wasn't supposed to be a daycare center for homicidal fuzzballs, but here they were anyway, cruising through the void with three Galaxy cubs who'd apparently decided that sleep was for the weak and terrorizing the crew was their new favorite hobby. Before we begin, YouTube shows me that 93% of you haven't subscribed yet. Subscribing is free, it really supports our community, and I'd love for you to be part of it. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Jamal wiped grease from his hands as another bone-chilling shriek echoed through the maintenance shaft. That was the third time in 20 minutes. At this rate, the ship's hull might actually crack from the sound alone, which would solve everyone's problems in the most permanent way possible. "Engineering to bridge," he muttered into his comm unit. "The life support systems are running fine, but I'm pretty sure our passengers are slowly going insane." Captain Oren's voice crackled back, strained and exhausted. "Join the club. We're all losing our minds up here." The Starwing Drift had been a simple transport vessel before the war came to the Outer Rim colonies. Now it was a floating refugee camp, packed to the bulkheads with displaced families from 6 different species. The lucky ones had escape pods. The unlucky ones had nothing but the clothes on their backs and the trauma of watching their worlds burn. Most species were handling the transition about as well as could be expected, meaning lots of crying, occasional panic attacks, and the usual bureaucratic nightmares that came with interspecies cooperation. But the Galaxy? Well, they were special. Picture apex predators, built like oversized wolves, crossed with bears, equipped with razor-sharp claws and teeth that could punch through steel plating. Now, imagine their cubs, smaller versions of these living weapons, stuck in a metal can for weeks without proper sleep. The adults were barely keeping it together, and their offspring were expressing their displeasure in ways that made everyone else seriously reconsider their life choices. Another shriek, followed by the unmistakable sound of something expensive being destroyed. Jamal sighed and pulled himself out of the maintenance shaft. Time to see what fresh hell was waiting in the passenger sections. The corridor leading to the Galaxy quarters looked like a war zone. Deep gouges scarred the walls where tiny claws had found purchase during what the ship's computer euphemistically called elevated activity periods. The adults called it cubs having tantrums. Everyone else called it reasons to stay very, very far away. Dr. Amelia rushed past him, medical kit in hand, and that particular expression that meant someone was about to receive an injection, whether they liked it or not. "How bad?" Jamal asked, falling into step beside her. "The cubs haven't slept in 4 days," she replied, not slowing down. "Their parents are exhausted, the other passengers are terrified, and Captain Oren is about 2 seconds away from spacing himself just to escape the noise." "What about sedatives?" "Tried that. Galaxy metabolism burns through most chemicals in minutes. The stuff strong enough to actually work might kill them. And explaining dead refugee cubs to the Galactic Council isn't exactly career advancement material." They rounded the corner and nearly collided with Raxton, one of the adult Galaxy males. Standing nearly 3 meters tall with midnight black fur and eyes like molten gold, he was the kind of creature that evolution had specifically designed to end other creatures. Right now, though, he looked like he wanted to end himself. "Doctor," he rumbled in that voice like grinding stone, "please tell me you have new ideas. Traditional songs, not working. Cubs refuse rest. Other families, complaining." Behind him, the sound of something else breaking echoed from their quarters, followed by frustrated chittering and what sounded suspiciously like a small explosion. "Gornax found the portable fusion cell," Delara's voice called from inside, strained with exhaustion. Molin is trying to eat it. Amelia pushed past Raxton with the weary determination of someone who'd been dealing with medical impossibilities for far too long. Jamal started to follow, then stopped. Something about this whole situation was tickling the back of his mind. Some half-remembered solution from another life, another time. Before the war, before the refugee crisis, before he'd become a grease-stained maintenance engineer on a flying disaster, he'd been something else entirely. Someone who dealt with small creatures who refused to sleep, who threw tantrums, who needed something more than medicine or threats to calm down. "Raxton," he said slowly, "what exactly are you trying to get them to do? I mean, besides sleep." The massive predator's ears flicked with irritation. "Cubs must rest. Bodies require sleep for growth, for strength. Parents sing traditional lullabies, tell stories of great hunts, share wisdom of ancestors. Nothing works." "Stories about hunts," Jamal repeated thoughtfully. "Yeah, that's probably not helping." Through the open doorway, he could see the cubs in question. Gornax was the largest, about the size of a full-grown wolf, with silver-tipped fur and an expression of pure mischief. Silka was smaller, but somehow projected even more contained violence, her dark eyes constantly scanning for new things to investigate/destroy. And little Molin, barely larger than a house cat, but already sporting claws that could open vacuum-sealed containers, was indeed trying to gnaw on a fusion cell while his mother wrestled it away from him. They were beautiful in the way that perfectly designed killing machines often were. They were also completely, utterly, magnificently out of control. "Has anyone tried different stories?" Jamal asked. Raxton's confusion was palpable. "Different? What other stories are there? Cubs must learn heritage, learn strength, learn to hunt." "Right. But what if they don't need to learn how to hunt right now? What if they need to learn how to, I don't know, not hunt?" The look Raxton gave him suggested that Jamal had just proposed teaching fish to fly. "Not hunt? This makes no sense." Captain Oren's voice suddenly boomed over the ship's intercom, cutting through their conversation. "All crew to stations. We've got incoming distress signals from 3 more refugee ships. Prep the docking bays and find somewhere to put another 200 passengers." Jamal looked at the chaos in the Galaxy quarters, then at Raxton's exhausted expression, then back at the cubs, who were now apparently trying to construct something explosive out of medical supplies. "You know what," he said, surprising himself. "Let me try something. What's the worst that could happen?" Raxton's expression suggested he had several very specific ideas about what the worst could be, most of them involving Jamal in several pieces. But desperation, apparently, was stronger than skepticism. "You wish to help with cubs?" "I used to work with small creatures who wouldn't sleep," Jamal said carefully. "Different species, same basic problem. Give me 10 minutes with them." "10 minutes," Dulara called from inside, having apparently overheard, "and if they haven't killed you, maybe they will finally be tired enough to rest." It wasn't exactly a ringing endorsement, but it was permission. Jamal took a deep breath, stepped into the quarters, and prepared to either solve an interspecies crisis or become the galaxy's most unusual chew toy. The cubs looked up at him with the kind of interest usually reserved for new and exciting prey items. This was either going to be brilliant or spectacularly stupid. Probably both. "Absolutely not." Captain Oren's voice carried the kind of finality usually reserved for death sentences and quarterly budget reports. "I'm not letting a maintenance engineer play babysitter to 3 walking weapons of mass destruction." Jamal stood in the bridge's center, surrounded by holographic displays showing the Star Wing Drift's increasingly precarious situation. Stress fractures were appearing in the lower decks. Apparently, Galaxy Cubs could generate sonic frequencies that resonated with the ship's superstructure. Who knew? "With all due respect, Captain," Jamal said, "your current plan isn't exactly working either. My current plan involves not explaining to the Galactic Refugee Commission why our maintenance staff got mauled by homesick predator children." "They're not homesick," Jamal said quietly. "They're scared." The bridge fell silent, except for the constant background hum of failing life support systems and the distant sound of something else being enthusiastically destroyed 3 decks down. "Scared?" Amelia looked up from her medical reports, eyebrows raised. "Those cubs could take down a full-grown Terran bear. What exactly would they be scared of?" Jamal found himself thinking back to another time, another place. A small classroom on Earth Colony 16, before the war consumed everything. Small faces looking up at him, wide eyes filled with confusion and fear they couldn't articulate. "Everything," he said simply. "Their world's gone. Their friends are gone. Nothing smells right. Nothing sounds right. Nothing feels safe. Adults keep whispering about things they don't understand, and everyone expects them to just handle it." Captain Oren's expression softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "That's very touching, but it doesn't change the fact that you're not qualified for this." "Actually," Jamal said, pulling up his personnel file on the nearest display, "I am." The hologram flickered to life, showing his complete work history. Most of it was standard maintenance and engineering certifications, but there, buried in the earlier entries, was something else entirely. "Childhood Development Specialist," Amelia read aloud. "Specialized in trauma response and behavioral management. 5 stellar teaching commendations." She looked up at him with new interest. "You were an educator." "For 8 years," Jamal confirmed, "before the war reached the outer colonies and being able to fix life support systems became more valuable than teaching kids to finger paint." Captain Oren studied the file, his expression unreadable. "Why didn't you mention this before?" "Because fixing broken engines seemed more immediately useful than my ability to get 6-year-olds to take naps." Another shriek echoed through the ship, this one carrying a distinctly different pitch that made everyone wince. "That was Silka," Braxton's voice came over the comm, sounding utterly defeated. "She has discovered the sonic shower controls. I apologize in advance for whatever happens next." The lights flickered as something in the lower decks overloaded. Captain Oren closed his eyes, counted to 10 in what sounded like 3 different languages, then opened them with the expression of a man who'd run out of conventional options. "Fine. You get 1 chance. But if those cubs so much as scratch you, I'm spacing the lot of them and explaining it to the council later." "Understood, Captain." "And Jamal?" Oren's voice stopped him at the bridge exit. "What exactly are you planning to do that 3-meter-tall apex predators with parental instincts couldn't manage?" Jamal paused, thinking about story time in a converted storage bay on Colony 16, about small voices begging for just one more tale before bedtime, about the magic that happened when imagination met need. Tell them a story. The silence that followed was so complete that the ship's various alarms seemed deafeningly loud by comparison. "A story," Captain Oren repeated slowly. "A story. You're planning to calm 3 hyperactive predator cubs with words. It's worked before." "On what, exactly?" "Human children who'd survived orbital bombardments and watched their families disappear into refugee processing centers." The weight of that statement settled over the bridge like a heavy blanket. Everyone aboard had their own version of that story, Their own losses, their own trauma, their own reasons for being on a crowded transport ship instead of home. Right, Captain Oren said finally. Go tell your story. Try not to become one yourself. The journey back to the Galaxy quarters felt longer than usual, partly because Jamal kept having to step around new damage, and partly because he was trying to figure out exactly what story might work on three sleepless predator cubs who'd been raised on tales of glorious hunts and ancestral victories. Goldilocks was probably out. Little Red Riding Hood seemed like it might send the wrong message. And somehow he doubted that Goodnight Moon was going to translate well to species that had evolved to hunt by starlight. He found the cubs' parents clustered outside their quarters, looking like they were considering various forms of surrender. Dulara was leaning against the wall, with the exhausted posture of someone who'd been wrestling with forces beyond her comprehension. Raxton was methodically sharpening his claws on the bulkhead, which probably wasn't doing the ship's hull any favors, but seemed to be keeping him calm. "Any changes?" Jamal asked. Molin ate the emergency food supplies, Dulara reported without looking up. All of them, including the packaging. Gornax has taken apart the environmental controls, Raxton added. He appears to be building something. And Silka? Silka has claimed the sonic shower as her territory and is defending it against all intruders, including us. From inside the quarters came the sound of metal being enthusiastically rearranged, and what might have been singing if singing typically involved sounds that could shatter crystal. "Right," Jamal said, pulling up every technique he'd learned in 8 years of dealing with traumatized children. "Let's try something different." He knocked on the door frame, politely, as if he were visiting civilized beings instead of tiny engines of destruction. The sounds from inside stopped immediately. "Hello," he called out in his best storytime voice, calm, friendly, and completely unafraid. "My name is Jamal. I was wondering if anyone in there might like to hear about the time 3 brave cubs saved an entire space station." Silence. Then, very quietly, a voice that sounded like gravel being stirred with a stick. "Cubs saved station." "Oh, yes," Jamal said, settling down cross-legged just outside the doorway where they could see him but still feel safe. "It's quite a tale. These weren't just any cubs, you see. They were the bravest, smartest, most curious cubs in the entire galaxy. And they lived on a ship that was traveling between the stars, just like this one." A small head appeared at the edge of the doorway. Molin, the youngest, peered out with eyes like liquid amber, his tiny claws gripping the doorframe. What did cubs do?" he asked in a voice barely above a whisper. "Well," Jamal said, leaning forward conspiratorially, "it all started when they realized that the adults on their ship had forgotten something very important. And for the first time in 4 days, the Starwing Drift was filled with something other than the sounds of destruction. It was filled with the sound of rapt attention. And so," Jamal continued, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who'd turned storytelling into an art form, "the 3 cubs realized that the space station's computers weren't broken at all. They were just lonely. All those beeping sounds and flashing lights? The station was trying to make friends the only way it knew how." Molin had crept closer during the tale, followed by Silka, who'd abandoned her sonic shower fortress to listen. Even Gornax had emerged from whatever mechanical carnage he'd been orchestrating, his silver-tipped ears perked forward with unmistakable interest. "But how did cubs know this?" Silka asked, her voice carrying that particular mixture of skepticism and hope that all children possessed when confronted with something that seemed too good to be true. "Because they listened," Jamal said simply. "Not with their ears. Anyone can do that. They listened with their hearts. And when you listen with your heart, you can hear things that adults miss because they're too busy being worried about everything else. Raxton and Dulara had appeared at the edge of his peripheral vision, both looking like they'd witnessed something miraculous, which, in a way, they had. 3 hyperactive predator cubs sitting still and paying attention for longer than 30 seconds. Did the cubs fix the station? Gornax wanted to know, his earlier mechanical project apparently forgotten. They did better than that, Jamal said. They taught the station how to make friends with all the other ships that visited. And from that day forward, instead of beeping and flashing scary lights, the station would play gentle music and show beautiful pictures of distant stars to welcome travelers. Like lullabies, Molin asked, his voice growing soft around the edges. Exactly like lullabies. The youngest cub yawned, an enormous yawn that showed teeth capable of shredding steel plating, but somehow managed to be absolutely adorable. His eyelids were starting to droop, and he swayed slightly where he sat. "Tell another story," Silka demanded, though her own voice was losing some of its sharp edges. "About cubs who found new homes." Jamal glanced at Raxton and Dulara, seeing the understanding pass between them. The cubs weren't just tired. They were processing their own situation through the lens of make-believe, trying to find hope in tales of fictional adventures. "Once upon a time," he began, settling into what was clearly going to be a longer session, "there were 3 cubs who had to leave their beautiful forest home because of a terrible storm. By the time he'd finished that story, and the next one, and the one after that, all 3 cubs were curled up in a pile, breathing slowly and deeply." Molin was actually snoring, tiny rumbles that would have been terrifying from an adult Galaxy, but were somehow endearing from someone no bigger than a house cat. "Incredible," Dulara whispered, staring at her sleeping offspring like they were some kind of miracle. "How did you—" "They just needed different stories," Jamal explained quietly. "Tales about solving problems instead of creating them. About making friends instead of enemies. About finding safety in new places instead of mourning what they'd lost." "And they understood?" Raxton's voice carried a note of wonder. "The concepts translated?" "Fear is universal," Jamal said. "So is hope. The specifics might change between species, but the emotions are the same." Word of the sleeping cubs miracle spread through the ship faster than a hull breach. By the next evening, Jamal had an audience that extended well beyond the Galaxy quarters. Curious faces peered around corners, some human, some distinctly not human, all drawn by the impossible sight of 3 predator cubs sleeping peacefully through the night. "You know," Captain Oren said during their morning briefing, "the stress fractures in the lower decks have stopped expanding. For the first time in weeks, we're not losing structural integrity. Also," Amelia added with the satisfaction of a doctor whose patients were finally cooperating, "the cubs' health readings are stabilizing. Proper sleep is apparently just as important for Galaxy physiology as it is for humans." "What I want to know," said Lieutenant Ross from Engineering, "is whether this story thing works on other species. Because we've got Faloran families who are still having nightmares, and those aquatic Morthak younglings won't stop that clicking noise they make when they're anxious." "Only one way to find out," Jamal said. That evening's story session had grown into something resembling a small gathering. The Galaxy cubs remained his primary audience, but they'd been joined by several Faloran children, delicate, bird-like creatures with enormous eyes and a tendency to startle at sudden movements. The young Morthak had claimed the corner near the environmental recycling unit where the humidity was higher and they could keep their gill slits properly moist. Tonight, Jamal announced to his mixed-species audience, "I want to tell you about the great ship of many voices." The story he wove was more complex than his earlier tales, designed to speak to the specific fears and hopes of each species present. The ship in his story was crewed by beings who looked different, spoke different languages, ate different foods, and came from worlds that spun around different stars. At first, he continued, nobody could understand anybody else. The singers, a nod to the Faloran children whose species communicated partially through melodic tones, thought everyone else was being rude by not harmonizing properly. The deep swimmers, the Morthak younglings, clicked appreciatively at this reference, couldn't understand why everyone insisted on breathing air instead of water. And the star hunters, Gornax, Silka, and Molin, perked up immediately, wondered why nobody else wanted to practice their stalking skills. "But what happened?" asked one of the Faloran children, her voice like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Well, that's the wonderful part," Jamal said. "They all got lost." This was clearly not the answer his audience had expected. "Lost?" Molin's voice was slightly indignant. "But they were on ship." "Lost in space," Jamal confirmed gravely. Their navigation system failed, and nobody could figure out how to fix it, because they were all too busy arguing about whose way of doing things was the right way. The children leaned forward, completely invested now. So what did they do? They sat down together, singers, swimmers, and hunters, and they started sharing stories about their home worlds. Not arguing about whose home was better, just sharing. And as they shared their stories, something amazing happened. "What?" This from several voices at once. They realized that every world had stars. Every world had families who cared about each other. Every world had children who needed to feel safe, and adults who wanted to protect them. And once they understood that, really understood it, they stopped trying to fix their navigation system the way their own people would do it. "How did they fix it then?" Silka wanted to know. "Together." The singers used their voices to create a harmony that resonated with the ship's communication systems. The swimmers used their knowledge of fluid dynamics to reroute power through the ship's cooling systems, and the hunters used their keen senses to detect the faintest signals from distant beacons. The mixed audience of children was hanging on every word. And it worked? It worked better than any of them had imagined possible. Not only did they find their way home, but they discovered something else. They'd become a family. Not the same kind of family they'd had on their birth worlds, but a new kind. A chosen family. As Jamal finished the tale, he noticed that his audience had unconsciously arranged itself differently than when he'd started. The Faloran children were no longer huddled in their own group, but were sitting close to the Morthak younglings, apparently fascinated by the patterns of bioluminescence that played across their aquatic neighbor's skin when they were content. The Galaxy cubs had positioned themselves protectively around the smaller children, their predatory instincts transformed into guardian behavior. "Will you tell more stories tomorrow?" asked one of the Morthak younglings, her words bubbling through the translation device. "Every night," Jamal promised, "as long as you need them." But even as he spoke, he was becoming aware that the story sessions were attracting attention beyond their immediate audience. Adult refugees had started lingering in the corridor during his tales, and he'd noticed that the ambient stress level throughout the ship seemed to be decreasing. "Jamal?" Captain Oren's voice came over his personal comm as he was helping tuck the cubs into their sleeping area. "I need to see you on the bridge. We've got a situation." The situation turned out to be a holographic display showing communication logs from the refugee fleet's other ships. "We're receiving requests," Captain Oren explained, gesturing at the scrolling messages. "Other ships want to know about our pacification protocols for mixed-species youth populations. Apparently, word has spread that we've solved our predator-cub problem." "It's not just the cubs anymore," Amelia added, pulling up medical statistics. "Anxiety levels are down across all age groups. Sleep quality has improved. Even the adults are showing reduced stress markers." "Here's the interesting part," Lieutenant Ross said, highlighting specific entries in the communication logs. "3 other ships have tried copying your methods. The ones that are just playing recorded stories are seeing limited success. But the ship that has a human crew member doing live storytelling sessions is reporting results similar to ours." Jamal studied the data, a growing awareness settling in his mind. It's not just the stories themselves, is it? It's the interaction. The fact that someone is sitting there with them, fully present, completely focused on their needs in that moment. "Apparently so," Captain Oren said. "Which brings me to our next problem. The Fleet Command wants to implement human story protocols across the entire refugee convoy. Congratulations, you've just invented a new form of interspecies diplomacy." "That's—" Jamal paused, trying to process the implications. "That's actually kind of terrifying." "Why terrifying?" Amelia asked. "Because stories have power," Jamal said slowly. "Real power. They shape how we see ourselves, how we see others, how we believe the world works. If I'm telling stories that are influencing how entire species relate to each other." He trailed off, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "Then you'd better make sure they're the right stories," Captain Oren finished. Outside in the corridor, Jamal could hear the sound of children playing. Not just Galaxy cubs, but Faloran and Morthak younglings as well. Their different forms of communication blending into something that sounded almost musical. It was a sound that hadn't existed anywhere in the galaxy until a few days ago. The sound of interspecies friendship being born. "No pressure," he muttered to himself, but he was already thinking about tomorrow's story, about the themes he wanted to explore, about the seeds of understanding he wanted to plant. After all, if you were going to accidentally invent a new form of diplomacy, you might as well do it properly. 3 weeks into what the ship's crew had started calling the golden age of functional sleep schedules, everything went sideways in the most spectacular way possible. It started with Admiral Vexandra of the Galaxy Warfleet requesting a private communication with Captain Oren, which would have been unusual enough under normal circumstances, but became downright alarming when she specifically asked to speak with the human who tells cubs stories. "This can't be good," Jamal muttered, standing on the bridge and staring at the massive holographic projection of a Galaxy military leader who looked like she could bite through starship hulls for breakfast. "Relax," Captain Oren said, though his own posture suggested he was anything but relaxed. "Maybe she just wants parenting advice." Admiral Vexandra's image flickered to full clarity, revealing a scarred veteran with ice-blue eyes and the kind of presence that made grown spacers check their life insurance policies. Her gaze fixed immediately on Jamal with predatory intensity. "You are the storyteller," she stated. Not a question. Yes, ma'am. Yes, Admiral. I mean—" Jamal stopped himself before he could dig the verbal hole any deeper. "Yes. Good. I need to understand something. My intelligence reports indicate that refugee children from multiple species are now cooperating, playing together, sharing resources. This is not normal behavior." "Well, no," Jamal agreed carefully, "but it's not exactly abnormal either. Children are naturally curious about You misunderstand, Admiral Vexandra interrupted. I do not mean it is unusual for children to cooperate. I mean it should be impossible. The Feloran and Morthak species have been in territorial disputes for 3 generations. The Galaxy have considered both species as potential prey items for longer than recorded history. The temperature on the bridge seemed to drop several degrees. And yet, the Admiral continued, my scouts report that Galaxy cubs are actively protecting Feloran younglings from perceived threats. Morthak children are sharing their specialized dietary supplements with predator species who would naturally hunt them. This should not be possible unless... She paused, studying Jamal with uncomfortably sharp attention. Unless what? Captain Oren prompted. Unless the children understand something that the adults have forgotten, Admiral Vexandra said slowly. Tell me, storyteller, what exactly are you teaching them? Jamal thought about the previous night's story session, where he'd told a tale about a group of young explorers who discovered that the monster terrorizing their colony was actually just scared and lonely, trying to communicate in the only way it knew how. I tell them stories about solving problems instead of fighting them, he said honestly, about understanding instead of fearing, about finding common ground instead of focusing on differences. Admiral Vexandra was quiet for a long moment. And these stories, they work? You'd have to ask the children. I intend to. But first, I have something to show you. All of you. The holographic display shifted, showing a tactical overview of the war zones that had displaced everyone aboard the refugee fleet. Red indicators marked conflict areas. Yellow showed contested territories, and blue represented the few remaining neutral zones. This, Admiral Vexandra said grimly, is why we are all here. The Feloran-Morthak territorial war has been raging for decades. Resource disputes, border conflicts, cultural misunderstandings that escalated into violence. Standard interspecies politics. Standard? Amelia's voice carried a note of disbelief. Standard, the Admiral confirmed. Until recently. 3 months ago, my analysts began noticing something unusual in the conflict patterns. The display zoomed in on specific battle zones, highlighting communication intercepts and tactical reports. Both sides began making strategic errors, attacks that made no sense, resource seizures that served no apparent purpose, almost as if they were fighting not for territory or resources, but simply to maintain the conflict itself. Captain Oren leaned forward, studying the data. That doesn't make sense. Why would they want to keep fighting? Because someone benefits from the war, Admiral Vexandra said darkly. Someone who profits from keeping the Feloran and Morthak focused on each other instead of noticing what was being taken from their undefended colonies. The pieces clicked together in Jamal's mind with horrible clarity. The attacks on the Outer Rim settlements, the ones that displaced everyone on these refugee ships. Precisely. While the Feloran and Morthak were busy shooting at each other over meaningless border disputes, a third party was systematically raiding their most valuable worlds, taking resources, capturing populations for the slave trade, eliminating anyone who might have been able to organize effective resistance. Who? Captain Oren's voice was deadly quiet. That is still being investigated. But the method is clear. Create artificial conflicts to distract from real threats. Keep potential allies fighting each other so they cannot unite against the true enemy. The implications were staggering. Every refugee on every ship in the convoy was here, not because of legitimate territorial disputes, but because they'd been manipulated into destroying each other while pirates strip-mined their worlds. The children, Jamal said suddenly. That's why the story sessions are working so well. The cubs and the Faloran younglings and the Morthak children, they don't have generations of artificial hatred to overcome. They're responding to stories about cooperation because cooperation is actually natural for them. Exactly, Admiral Vexandra said, and for the first time since the conversation began, she almost smiled. Which brings me to my request. I want you to tell your stories to the adults. I'm sorry, what? The refugee fleet contains military personnel from all three species, she explained. Combat veterans, tactical specialists, engineers, pilots, everything we need to mount an effective response against whoever orchestrated this disaster. But they refuse to work together because they still believe they are enemies. And you think stories will change that? I think, Admiral Vexandra said carefully, that truth has power. And sometimes truth is best conveyed through stories that help people see past their assumptions. 2 hours later, Jamal found himself in the ship's main cargo bay, facing an audience that looked like it could collectively conquer a small solar system. Galaxy warriors sat in defensive positions, their eyes constantly scanning for threats. Faloran military engineers huddled in tight formations, their melodic communications creating an undercurrent of nervous harmony. Morthak naval specialists had claimed the areas near the atmospheric recyclers, their aquatic forms glistening under the harsh cargo bay lighting. Nobody was sitting close to anybody else. Right, Jamal said, his voice carrying across the massive space through the ship's intercom system. I know this is unusual. Most of you are probably wondering why you're listening to bedtime stories instead of planning military operations. A few snorts of derision from various corners of the room. But here's the thing about stories, he continued, settling into the voice and posture that had served him well with both children and traumatized refugees. They're how we make sense of things that don't make sense. They're how we find patterns in chaos. He gestured to the mixed crowd before him. 3 months ago, you were all fighting each other. Today, your children are playing together in the corridors of this ship, sharing toys and food and friendship like the most natural thing in the universe. That change didn't happen because of military orders or diplomatic treaties. It happened because someone told them stories that helped them see past the assumptions they'd inherited. Stories do not win wars, growled a scarred Galaxy veteran. No, Jamal agreed, but they can prevent unnecessary ones. He pulled up the tactical displays that Admiral Vexandra had shared, projecting them for everyone to see. Let me tell you a story about 3 groups of people who were so busy fighting each other that they never noticed the pirates stealing everything they owned. What followed was perhaps the most important story of Jamal's life. He walked the audience through the timeline of their conflicts, showing how each escalation had been carefully orchestrated, each provocation designed to keep their attention focused inward instead of outward. He told them about refugee children who had no idea they were supposed to be enemies, and how quickly artificial hatred dissolved when it wasn't constantly reinforced by fresh grievances. The children figured it out first, he concluded, not because they're smarter than you, but because they weren't carrying the weight of manipulated history. They could see clearly what adults couldn't. That cooperation was not only possible, but natural. The cargo bay was silent for a long moment. Then a Faloran engineer stood up. You are saying our entire war was manufactured? I'm saying your entire war was profitable, Jamal corrected. For someone else. Who? The question came from multiple voices simultaneously. That, said Admiral Vexandra, her holographic form materializing at the front of the cargo bay, is what we need to find out. Together. The planning session that followed would have been impossible 3 months ago. Species that had considered each other mortal enemies were comparing tactical assessments, sharing intelligence, coordinating resources. The breakthrough came when a young Morthak navigator mentioned detecting unusual energy signatures in the contested border zones. Signatures that matched readings from Galaxy deep space monitoring stations and Faloran atmospheric sensors. Cloaked mining operations, breathed a Faloran tactical specialist. Someone's been strip mining the contested territories while we were shooting at each other. Not someone, said Admiral Vexandra grimly. The Ravager Consortium. Pirates, slavers, and resource thieves operating out of the void reaches. We've been hunting them for stellar cycles, but they always stayed one step ahead of us. Because they had us doing their work for them, a Galaxy squadron leader snarled, keeping the legitimate authorities busy with meaningless conflicts while they looted everything of value. The mood in the cargo bay shifted from confused cooperation to unified fury. So what do we do about it? Asked the same Faloran engineer who'd questioned the manufactured war. We do what the children have been doing, Jamal said, surprising himself with his own certainty. We choose cooperation over conflict. We choose understanding over assumption. We choose to build something new instead of destroying what already exists. Pretty words, said a Morthak commander, but the Ravagers have warships and fortified bases. Choosing cooperation will not make their weapons less dangerous. No, Admiral Vexandra agreed, but choosing cooperation means we can finally match their firepower. The combined fleets of all three species, coordinated and working in unison, represent the largest naval force this sector has seen in generations. A fleet made up of people who were shooting at each other last month, someone pointed out. A fleet made up of people who now understand they were manipulated into shooting at each other, Jamal corrected. People who have children playing together in the corridors of refugee ships. People who have a chance to build something better than what they lost. The debate continued for hours, but the outcome was never really in doubt. When children can see past artificial divisions, adults have no excuse for maintaining them. 6 months later, the Starwing Drift was no longer a refugee transport. It had been converted into the flagship of the Combined Fleet's New Colony Ship program. Vessels designed not just to carry displaced populations to new worlds, but to help them build integrated communities from the ground up. Jamal stood in what used to be the cargo bay, but was now officially designated as the Cultural Integration Center, watching the evening story session. His audience had grown beyond anything he could have imagined. Children and adults from dozens of species, all gathered to hear tales of cooperation, understanding, and the radical idea that differences were strengths rather than threats. Gornax, Silka, and Molin were still his most faithful attendees, though they were no longer tiny cubs. They'd grown into young Galaxy, with the confidence that came from knowing they belonged somewhere, surrounded by friends who valued them for who they were, rather than fearing them for what they might become. Tell the one about the Great Library, Silka requested, her voice now carrying the deeper tones of adolescence, but retaining the eager curiosity that had made her such a good student. The Great Library of Shared Wisdom, Jamal agreed, settling into his storytelling position, where beings from across the galaxy brought not weapons or treasures, but stories, and where they learned that the most powerful force in the universe wasn't conquest or domination, but the simple act of truly listening to someone else's truth. As he spoke, Jamal caught sight of Admiral Vexandra in the back of the crowd. She'd started attending the sessions months ago, officially to monitor interspecies integration protocols. But really, he suspected, because she enjoyed the stories as much as anyone else. The Ravager Consortium had been defeated, their leadership captured, and their stolen resources returned to the rightful owners. The artificial conflicts that had torn apart three civilizations were being replaced by cooperative trade agreements and shared defense pacts. And at the heart of it all were the children who had figured out what the adults couldn't. That choosing to see others as friends instead of enemies was not naive idealism, but the most practical philosophy in the universe. And so, Jamal concluded that night's tale, the great library grew and grew until its stories reached every corner of the galaxy. And wherever those stories went, understanding followed. Because in the end, the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies. It's discovering that you never needed enemies at all. The audience dispersed slowly, adults and children alike reluctant to end the session. But they would return tomorrow night, and the night after that, and the night after that. Because some traditions, once they take root, become too valuable to abandon. Later, as Jamal was tidying up the integration center, Captain Oren found him. The Colonial Council has approved our request for permanent settlement rights on Kepler Station, he reported. We'll have facilities for up to 50,000 residents, full industrial capacity, and educational systems designed around your methods. Our methods, Jamal corrected. I just told stories. Everyone else did the real work of building something new. Don't sell yourself short, Captain Oren said. You didn't just tell stories. You gave people permission to imagine a better future. That's not a small thing. As the ship's artificial night cycle settled over the corridors, Jamal made his final rounds through the residential sections. In the Galaxy quarters, cubs and parents alike slept peacefully, their dreams no longer haunted by loss and fear. The Faloran families sang soft harmonies that blended with the gentle bubbling sounds from the Morthak living areas, creating a ship-wide lullaby that spoke of home and safety and belonging. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories to tell, new bridges to build between different ways of thinking and being. But tonight, everyone slept well. And in the end, that was victory enough for anyone.